Hi, my name is Michael Morales, and this is my recording of my portfolio milestone presentation. My journey to becoming a data scientist began with an HR training presentation covering our tuition reimbursement program. The HR rep was explaining how the way that classes have to be presented individually instead of presenting the whole program for reimbursement. And she used data science as an example. She said, for instance, if you're in a data science program, you may take classes during that program that are applicable to your current career track and therefore would be eligible for reimbursement. But you also may take classes that are not eligible. And so, knowing that data science is multidisciplinary, she was using that as an example. That term data science, it was really fascinating to me. Something about it really got in my head. I'd never heard those two words used together, and something about those two words kind of spoke to my analytical mind. I felt like I'd discovered something new, and I really felt like it was probably largely unknown. And I still think that's the case today, even though this was several years ago. Although I'm happy to see that data science is becoming much more well known. And I started researching that day. During that meeting, as a matter of fact, I had my laptop in front of me and I got on Google and I looked up data science. I wanted to know what it was. And I spent weeks researching it. Those weeks, researching the jargon, researching all the applications of data science really prepared me for the process of gathering data. They also foreshadowed the work of that you undertake familiarizing yourself with a domain that you may not be familiar with for a project, and of course, preparing to interpret prediction model results. Collecting, curating all my own personal data, my resume and my transcripts and essays and things like that I had to prepare for multiple application processes. That was another way that didn't know it at the time, but I was preparing for the program and preparing for a career in data science for the real world application, of the knowledge that I would gain. So in the course of this presentation, what I hope to do is apply the training I've received and, to validate the expertise I've achieved as a result of my participation in the program. I hope to defend my knowledge and my competence by demonstrating how each of these courses and the projects that I've completed within them have contributed to my knowledge and my expertise and have also met or exceeded the objectives. So a little background on me. I have a bachelor's in English with a concentration in writing from American Public University system, which is also an online program. Obviously, no programming took place there and very little math, as a matter of fact. And prior to my education at APUS, I'd studied music for 2 years at the community college level. So again, no real deep math experience, no programming experience. So this program was my introduction to both of those areas. And I have to say that I really feel that Syracuse does an excellent job of preparing students for programming and dealing with math, linear algebra, and everything else that goes along with data science. Students who don't have any prior experience. I mean, I really have felt like I was very supported and like I got the education that I needed to move forward. And though I don't have any programming or that type of experience in my background, I am currently employed by Schneider Electric in an analyst role. So I do have some experience already with looking at very large data sets, analyzing them, moving data around between spreadsheets, organizing spreadsheets, large data sets, all sorts of stuff like that that are included in data science work. And then prior to that, I also was working for Ford Motor Credit for about 10 years in a credit analyst role. So again, that analytical background is there, just not in the same way as a data science role. And of course, data science is multidisciplinary, like I mentioned before. There's lots and lots of different areas of application. Some data scientists just use it very broadly and they apply it over lots of different subjects. Others are focused on one domain all the time and they have to learn that domain really well. And so I think that the program objectives are very applicable to the real world. And I wanted to kind of keep things organized, so I'll go through these in order. Excuse me. So for the objective 1, describing a broad overview, I'll kind of go over a lot of the different projects that I've worked on. The first one that I want to talk about is a project that I did for one of the first 2 classes, business analytics, the sort of entry-level stats class, where I had to sit with an intern at my work and kind of get an idea of his workflow and time his processes so that we could come up with a way to improve the amount of time that he was spending on that process. And I'll kind of talk about that in more detail later on. And then another one would be for IST 722 data warehousing, where we had Dr. Fudge, who made up this company Fudge Mart and another company Fudge Flix. The scenario being that they had recently merged, and we needed to take a look at their business practices and figure out what stakeholders wanted. That was probably one of the most challenging parts of that course, was that we weren't told what stakeholders wanted. We had to kind of look at the scenario and figure out what they wanted. And this is what we came up with, that they wanted to know total revenue across both companies, that they wanted to know where customer overlap was since the 2 companies had merged, that they would want to know sales information for Fudge Mart, and their database was not set up in a way that made that information easy to access, and that they'd want to know Fudge Flix revenue by account. And again, that wasn't set up where it was easy for them to access. And then in the 2 mining classes, IST 707 data mining and IST 736 text mining, these were the 2 classes where I really got a very, very deep education into communicating results with lay people who don't really know anything about data science processes, procedures, methods. 707 was taught by Dr. Amy Gates, who really, really stressed good writing. 736 was taught by Dr. John Bolton, who did the same, maybe not quite as much as Dr. Gates, but he really stressed that your communication skills have to be there. They have to be good. They have to really concentrate on people who don't know anything about data science and speak to them in ways that can familiarize them with the results without alienating them with a bunch of jargon. And then, of course, business intelligence and strategy. Those are areas related to data science. And I learned to use these methods in marketing analytics, in SCM 651 business analytics, and MBC 638 as well, data analytics, one of the entry-level classes again. For business analytics, or excuse me, for MBC 638, I completed, again, that was the process improvement project, and that had a direct impact on my job. That one was really important, and I'm actually going to go into more detail on that one on the next slide. So I'll talk about the marketing class, marketing analytics. Did a project with data from a website called Board Game Geek, and the data question that I wanted to answer was, how can board game makers tell if their products will be highly rated on Board Game Geek? So we did a regression analysis of the data from there. And the data was easy to come by, but there was a lot of information in it that wasn't necessary for the analysis. But the really interesting finding from that project was that complexity and a game's popularity were very, very closely correlated. That helped me to support my hypothesis that gaming popularity, board gaming popularity, was very much on the rise. And also saw with a time series analysis that complexity was also increasing with time, and so we're able to make a recommendation that increasing complexity of new games and reducing easy repeatability were keys to getting good reviews on Board Game Geek from the users there. And then again, for this project that I used work information for, work data, we have at Schneider Electric these data review requests. You have data that are bucketed in our database according to the category on the detailed page of an electric invoice. So you may have transmission charges, you may have distribution charges, and lots of other charges and taxes and things like that. And sometimes those charges are not bucketed correctly on the invoice template for entry into the database, and that causes lots of different problems. But at least for now, human intervention is necessary to correct those. So we had an intern who would sit and look for these errors, and when he would find them, then he had to go through several steps. He was having to look at other invoices, he was having to look at all kinds of different information, and then fill out a data review request on a help desk platform to submit a correction. And so I sat with him and got an idea of his workflow and timed each step. And this was the project that I submitted, or part of it. I was actually able to analyze what was going on, how he was doing things, and then I was able to go back and remeasure and to see if improvements had been made, and I found that the process was under control. That was something that took a lot of time, and my management there at work was very understanding and very gracious about allowing me to do that, because they did see the benefit of it, and we did reduce his time significantly in submitting those data review requests, and we're able to communicate with some other folks in the company what sort of processes we were using to share those results across the company. And for IST 707 data mining, I analyzed the World Cup results to try to form some sort of hypothesis about whether it's financially beneficial to host the tournament, and also whether winning or placing could be correlated to financial benefit. Eventually, what I found was that there just wasn't enough data to make any sort of meaningful predictions about who would win or who would place. But I did feel really confident in my ability to share my findings and explain the reasons why the data were a little too skewed and way too sparse to actually be useful in a predictive capacity. One of the other things I found was that FIFA does a really, really good job of making their financials look a whole lot better than they really are, and all they're really doing in that situation is showing how much money they make, and they're kind of hiding the fact that they really leave a wake of destruction in their path. And so this was a project where there was some agility that was needed, because it changed very quickly. So the next objective, collect and organize data. The projects I've completed during my time in the program have usually consisted of analyzing data that was either available from the class itself or in a spreadsheet format from online sources like Kaggle. So collection of data has involved just a lot of research of different websites, again like Kaggle, or others where JSON data might be available. So in my final project for IST 652, scripting for data analysis, I collected a bunch of JSON data from reddit.com. Reddit actually allows for the collection of JSON data without the need of an API. and all you do is add the .json extension to any of their sub URLs or subreddits, and it's really easy to get the data, which is great. The there's lots of different types of data on reddit.com because subreddits just vary across all sorts of different subjects. I wasn't able to employ that data in the final analysis, but I was able to employ the knowledge that I learned during the course to collect JSON data, and that's really what was important for the future. So organization of data is always necessary, and because the data aren't necessarily suited to the analysis. So for my next project, the powerlifting database project that I did for the Introduction to Data Science class, I had a very, very large CSV of 300,000 lifts from competitions worldwide over the years. And so one of the questions that we wanted to talk about in this project was the Wilks score. And the Wilks score didn't come about until somewhere around the early 80s. And so that was one of the first organizational things that I did with this data, was to get rid of any information prior to the 80s, since we really, really wanted to look at Wilks. And the Wilks score is a score used in powerlifting to even the playing field between men and women, and between people who are heavier and lighter. It allows a way to put scoring on a competitor's lifts according to their weight, their gender, things like that, so that you can kind of get an idea of competition regardless of those factors. So that was one of the big organizational things, was to remove lots and lots of data. There's also, this data went back to 1964, so it was a lot that we removed. And I ended up using only data from the last 30 years or so. And that being because even though the Wilks had been around prior to that, there weren't really any serious studies of it until around the mid-90s or so. And then, of course, I used the R to remove a lot of columns that weren't useful, like the class of the lifters, the federation that was sanctioning the meets. None of that stuff was important. Whether the lifter was tested for performance-enhancing drugs, all kinds of other stuff that really wasn't important to an analysis of Wilks score. But this this project ended up becoming more of a look at whether bench press, which is a chest and arm type of lift, had any effect on the squat and the deadlift, both of which employ mostly the legs. And ultimately, I was able to find a correlation between them, as you can see in the visualization here. And that was one of the most interesting findings of this project, and that wouldn't have been possible without some of that organization that we did of the data and getting rid of some of the stuff that wasn't necessary. So objective 3, identifying patterns in data visualization. This was a final project for IST 736 text mining, where I looked at Quora, which is a website where people are allowed to ask and answer questions. And this was actually a Kaggle contest. The goal of the project was to help Quora to identify insincere, toxic, abusive type of input questions rather on their website. And I found that using LDA to get topics was really, really useful, because it showed groupings of topics that where you could see a clear distinction between insincere or toxic or abusive subjects and the ones that were actually sincere. Topics like race, religion, and politics really, really stood out. Those are the ones where there was the most insincerity, the most toxicity. And this pattern-based finding was really, really useful, because I was able to make a recommendation that Core could actually use topic modeling to categorize questions even without using some sort of a prediction model. They could even just use topic modeling to categorize questions and flag them to later be further analyzed. And maybe this would be a first step for them. So objective 4, developing alternative strategies. Talked about this one just a little while ago, the World Cup project, where there was the need to be agile. It's really essential in data science because you really don't know before you begin exploratory data analysis what the data are going to tell you. You definitely don't know before you begin to familiarize yourself with the domain. So in this project, again, the original intent was, could we predict the winner of the next tournament? Could we predict who's going to place? Things like that. But again, the data was so sparse and so heavily skewed. You can see here that Brazil has won 5 times. Germany and Italy are tied for 4. Everyone else has only won it once or twice. And that obviously is heavily skewed data. But you're also seeing here that of 79 national teams that have played in the tournament, only 8 teams have ever won. So it's just basically impossible to tell who's going to win. So we ended up having to develop an alternative strategy based on what we found out from the data, which was to look more at the finances of the World Cup and see what we could learn about that. So objective 5, developing a plan of action to implement the business decisions. Again, going back to the Fudge Corp is what we ended up calling it, project for IST 722, where these two companies had merged. So we were able to look at ways to increase marketing effectiveness and to monitor KPIs across the whole enterprise. These weren't real-world organizations, but the scenario provided a situation that might be encountered in the real world, a merger. I mean, those things happen very often. They require stakeholders to find client crossover, to analyze the sales performance, not only separately, but also as an aggregate. They have to adjust their offering to potentially cater to a new client base. And so a key to accomplishing this was to look at the historical data and get an idea of what sort of trends were taking place, and that's what our dashboard provided. It also provided a way to judge which products were the most successful in the past and which ones are currently, trending upward. And we were able to make recommendations after assessing the data, kind of look at some things that that Fudge Corp would need to do in order to progress. Finding out why things were trending the way they were, whether up or down, and then that they needed to sort of improve their categories and look at the past purchasing behavior. So it was I sort of treated this project as though this was Amazon, a company that began as a book company and who has still maintained that core, but has also moved on to lots and lots of other products. As far as recommendations go, this was also I was able to make recommendations for the retail relay exercise, which wasn't a final project, but a homework for marketing analytics class. Kind of looking at the way that the customer history was trending for this restaurant called Sticks Kebab. We were able to look at what sort of things were causing customers to be retained, and found that the real clear picture was subscription services or subscription program, and so that was the recommendation. Same thing going back to the Board Game Geek project. We saw that complexity was really the key to getting good reviews, and so that was the recommendation that I was able to make. So objective 6, demonstrating communication skills for people who are across the enterprise in all kinds of different roles. Again, going back to IST 707 data mining taught by Dr. Amy Gates, she really, really did stress the gravity of communicating effectively, and especially to people who may have trouble understanding the results. And Dr. Bolton equally stressed the use, of visualization and lay language, to communicate these things. I really feel like both of these professors did a great job of giving me a lot of confidence to use the skills I learned gaining my English degree in my role as a data scientist. They really encouraged engaging the reading audience. I feel like a report fails if it doesn't have engagements, but it also needs to have a really solid message once that engagement has been established. So for the World Cup project, I felt like it was really important to introduce the World Cup to the audience by giving a brief history of it. And again, that kind of solidified the message that this tournament, with over 90 years nearly 90 years of history and 79 national teams that have played in it, only 8 teams have ever won it. For text mining, again, going back to the LDA, I had to explain what kind of discourse Quora wanted to encourage on their website. You can't just state the facts. You can't just have a bullet point. You need to have some visuals. You need to have ways to engage the audience to help them to understand what you're looking at. And so for this topic here, the one in the visualization here, previously there'd been a topic 2 for that project that was specific to the current president and the one before, so it was easy to see what the discussion was about. This one was not as easy. This one required a little bit more analysis, looking into it a little more deeply, but I was able to discover that it was about politics, the two political spectra that those two presidents are involved in relatively, and really kind of looked at the way that Quora is an open forum, and an open forum is not necessarily a good place for people to espouse their opinions. They're not really thinking about, and considering what they're saying sometimes, and there's not a lot of critical thought applied. And so politics, what I found from this analysis was that politics is probably not the best thing to be discussing on Quora. So objective 7, the ethical dimensions of data science practice. The example that's used is privacy. Private data needs to remain private. So the data that I've worked with during the program has all been anonymized, and data should always be anonymized anytime it's possible, even if it's not required, even if not anonymizing it might not have any negative effects right there in the near term. It's still a good idea to go ahead and do it anyway. And of course, in anytime the law requires it, really, really special care needs to be taken to ensure that you're in compliance with the law. Non-anonymized data needs to be analyzed. Data sets need to be kept secure because a lot of bad things can happen. In the news just recently, about 4 weeks ago, it was reported that the data on almost every citizen of Ecuador was leaked. And the whole idea behind it was that this was data that was being used for targeted advertising and recommendations. And that, of course, brings up the story of the famous Target example where, a father of a college-age young woman found out that she was pregnant because of the way that Target was, for lack of a better term, targeting ads aimed at her and kind of looking at her data and making determinations about what was going on with her. That was a situation where data wasn't really leaked or hacked or anything like that, but inadvertently that's exactly what happened. They released information about her without really meaning to. And so these things have to be considered, and the utmost care has to be taken. And one of the really important ethical considerations is bias. You can see in the comic here It's a pretty funny example of how bias works in our minds. But one of the things that's really important to consider is that bias can exist everywhere in the data life cycle. So, you need to know the motivation. What's motivating you to do this analysis? When you're collecting the data, is there bias, or are you collecting everything? Why are you making decisions on what to remove, what not to use? In the analysis, is the bias leaking into that? Certainly, bias can leak into the interpretation and communication of the data. And knowing that, and knowing how to identify bias is key to keeping it out. And so that brings us to the conclusion. My time has in this program has been extremely challenging. I've had to learn new ways to analyze information and formulate questions I never thought I would ask. It's really been demanding. And learning new ways of communicating. I have that English background, but I hadn't used these sort of ways of communicating, things like visualization and things like that. Finding patterns, which are around us all the time, but they're not always meaningful, and so that's important, and that's something that I've really learned. This program's taught me to seek meaning and insight in patterns, but to also always be skeptical of them. Prior to my education here at Syracuse, I would see correlations, and I just always assumed that they were meaningful. Now I know that there are relationships that can exist where none were intended and certainly weren't nourished or encouraged. Most of all, though, I've learned that research is really crucial. An analysis can't be effective without domain knowledge. Just as a master mechanic trained by Ford can't necessarily apply his knowledge to Porsche race cars. That's a really important distinction. The skills of applied data science are useless when they exist in a black box. They can't be interpreted and communicated in a meaningful way. So it's important to remember that the result of a prediction model isn't just a spreadsheet. It has to be interpreted. It has to be understood. It has to be communicated with people who might not be familiar with it. Thank you.